In the summer of 1944, an American armored sergeant named Curtis Culin looked at a captured German steel beach obstacle lying in the sand of Normandy and had an idea so simple that within a single week it would change the entire shape of the battle for France. By the last week of June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy had, on paper, already succeeded. The beaches were secure. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, and the entire weight of American industrial production had been landed on French soil, and the advance had, for all practical purposes, stopped dead. Not because of German firepower in the conventional sense, not because of some brilliant German counterattack, but because of hedges. Ordinary farm hedges, the kind that had marked the boundaries of small Norman fields for centuries, were doing what 6 years of German military engineering elsewhere in Europe had struggled to achieve, stopping an American armored advance in its tracks, field by field, for nearly 7 straight weeks. Before we go any further, a quick reminder. While a lot of channels rely on unverified, fake, or exaggerated rumors, we don't play that game. We value your trust. Everything on this channel is strictly verified. Today's episode is sourced from the official U.S. Army Center of Military History's Campaign Histories of Normandy, the first U.S. Army's own after-action reports from the Bocage fighting, and Max Hastings' documented history of the Normandy campaign, Overlord. Full source list is in the description below. This is a story about a landscape that neither side had properly planned for. An American army that had trained for open, mobile warfare and instead found itself fighting for individual fields the size of a suburban backyard, and a specific, almost embarrassingly simple piece of scrap metal welded onto the front of a tank by ordinary soldiers rather than any general or engineer that finally broke a stalemate that had already cost tens of thousands of casualties. This is the story of the Bocage, and of why the hedgerows of Normandy came closer to stopping the Allied advance in France than almost anyone, on either side, had ever expected a hedge to do. To understand how ordinary farm hedges became one of the most effective defensive terrain features of the entire European campaign, you first need to understand exactly what the bocage actually was, and why Allied planners, for all the extraordinary detail poured into planning the D-Day landings themselves, had given comparatively little serious thought to the terrain immediately behind those beaches. The bocage, at its simplest, is a particular and genuinely ancient way of organizing agricultural land that covers most of the interior of Normandy. Small fields, frequently no larger than a few acres each, separated not by simple wooden fences or hedgerows in the sense familiar to most English-speaking viewers, but by raised earthen banks, built up and reinforced over centuries, often several feet thick at the base, topped with dense, tangled vegetation whose root systems had, in many cases, been binding that same earthen bank together for 100 years or more. These were not hedges in the ornamental garden sense. They were, in the most literal engineering sense of the word, walls. Earthen ramparts several feet high and several feet thick, with roots and shrubs growing directly out of the compacted soil, forming a barrier that combined the structural mass of an actual fortification with the natural camouflage of ordinary farmland. Allied intelligence planning for the Normandy invasion had, in fairness, not been entirely blind to the existence of this terrain. Aerial photography, extensively used in the months leading up to D-Day to study German coastal defenses in minute detail, had, of course, captured the Bocage country as well, and Allied planners were broadly aware, in a general sense, that the interior of Normandy consisted of small, hedge-bound fields, rather than the kind of open, rolling terrain that would have suited a fast armored breakout. What Allied planning had genuinely failed to grasp, however, was the specific tactical significance this terrain would carry once actual combat began.
The sheer, granular difficulty of fighting through country where every single field functioned, in practice, as its own self-contained defensive position, and where the compacted earthen banks themselves were frequently too dense and too thick for a tank to simply drive through without exposing its vulnerable underside armor in the attempt. This gap between aerial reconnaissance and genuine tactical understanding reflects something that recurs across military history more broadly, and that this documentary's title is really pointing toward. A landscape can appear from the air, or on a map, or in a planning document, to be simply agricultural terrain, unremarkable and easily traversed, while concealing, at ground level, a genuinely formidable set of defensive characteristics that only become fully apparent once soldiers are actually moving through it under fire. Normandy's Bocage was exactly this kind of landscape, deceptively ordinary from above and devastatingly effective at ground level in ways that would take Allied forces weeks of costly, grinding combat to fully understand and eventually overcome.
Let's walk through in specific tactical detail exactly what made the Bocage such a genuinely difficult defensive terrain to fight through. Because understanding the precise mechanics of why hedgerows work so well defensively is essential to understanding everything that follows in this documentary. Each individual field in the Bocage country, bounded on all sides by these raised earthen banks, functioned as a self-contained defensive pocket. A German machine gun team or a small infantry squad positioned behind one of these earthen banks gained an almost ideal defensive position, elevated slightly above the field itself, protected by several feet of compacted earth and root mass that could absorb small arms fire and considerable artillery fragmentation, with clear fields of fire across the open field in front of them, and with the bank itself providing genuine cover to retreat behind or reposition along once an attacking force began to close the distance. An advancing American infantry squad, by contrast, had to cross open, exposed ground within the field itself to reach the German position, frequently under direct fire the entire way, before then facing the additional physical challenge of actually getting over or through the earthen bank itself to close with the defenders. And once that first field had finally been cleared, at whatever cost in casualties and time that particular fight had required, the exact same tactical problem simply repeated itself in the next field over, sometimes as little as 50 yards away. German defenders, where their own casualties and ammunition allowed, could and frequently did simply fall back to the next hedgerow line and reconstitute the same defensive position all over again, forcing attacking American units to fight what amounted to a fresh small battle for every single field along their axis of advance. The specific tactical problem this created for armored vehicles deserves particular attention because it's central to understanding the specific American technical solution this documentary is ultimately building toward. American Sherman tanks attempting to support infantry advancing through this terrain faced a genuinely difficult tactical dilemma at every single hedgerow line. A tank could not easily drive directly through the earthen bank. The compacted soil and root mass was simply too dense and too thick for a Sherman's engine and transmission to push through under normal circumstances. A tank attempting to climb directly over the bank, meanwhile, exposed its thin belly armor, normally protected from enemy fire by the tank's own hull and the ground beneath it, directly to German anti-tank gunners and infantry equipped with the shaped charge Panzerfaust handheld anti-tank weapons specifically, learned very quickly to watch for exactly this moment. A Sherman tank cresting a hedgerow bank, belly exposed, gun pointed away from any useful target, and treads momentarily unable to reverse or maneuver, as the single most reliable opportunity to destroy an American tank at close range throughout the entire Bocage fighting.
Let's establish the human and material cost of this specific tactical problem, because the numbers involved illustrate just how genuinely serious a threat the Bocage terrain posed to the entire Allied campaign in the weeks immediately following the D-Day landings. From the initial landings on the 6th of June 1944 through the eventual American breakout from Normandy in late July, Allied forces, and American forces specifically operating in the western sector of the beachhead where Bocage terrain was most heavily concentrated, found their advance measured not in miles per day, the pace military planners had generally anticipated for this phase of the campaign, but frequently in mere hundreds of yards, one field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, at a human cost that alarmed even senior Allied commanders who had, by this point in the war, already witnessed considerable combat losses across multiple earlier campaigns. Casualty rates during this specific phase of the Normandy campaign reached levels that, by several documented unit-level accounts, meant an infantry company could expect to lose a significant proportion of its original personnel within a matter of weeks, replaced continuously by fresh troops who then faced the exact same brutal field-by-field fighting conditions their predecessors had already been ground down by. The psychological toll of this specific style of fighting deserves particular mention as well, because it differed in a specific, documented way from combat experiences in more open terrain elsewhere in the European theater. The Bocage's compartmentalized structure meant that soldiers frequently thought and died within sight of comrades in an adjacent field who might have no idea a firefight was even occurring, separated as they were by dense hedgerow vegetation that blocked both sight lines and frequently effective radio communication between adjacent units. This created a genuinely disorienting, isolating combat experience that several documented American veteran accounts specifically identify as psychologically distinct from, and in several individual accounts, more difficult to endure than combat in more open terrain, where at least visual contact with supporting friendly units provided some measure of psychological reassurance amid the chaos of battle. If a story about how ordinary agricultural terrain became one of the most effective defensive weapons of the entire European campaign is the kind of history you want more of, take a moment to subscribe. It helps stories like this one find the people who would value them. Now, let's turn to the specific German side of this equation and to the genuinely important question of exactly how much of the Bocage's defensive effectiveness was the product of deliberate German planning versus simple German improvisation in response to terrain that, in truth, neither side had fully anticipated before the actual fighting began. This is a genuinely important question to address directly, because popular retellings of the Bocage fighting sometimes imply, whether explicitly or simply through narrative framing, that German commanders had deliberately and specifically prepared the Bocage as a defensive killing zone well in advance of the Allied invasion, anticipating exactly the tactical dynamics that would go on to unfold there. The actual historical record, drawn from surviving German military planning documents and post-war accounts from German officers who fought in this specific sector, tells a considerably more complicated and, in its own way, more genuinely interesting story. German defensive planning for Normandy in the months leading up to the invasion had focused overwhelmingly, and for entirely understandable reasons given the specific defensive doctrine and available resources of the period, on the beaches themselves. The elaborate system of bunkers, obstacles, and coastal artillery positions that collectively constituted the Atlantic Wall, and that Allied planners had spent considerable effort studying and preparing to overcome during the actual landing operations. The interior terrain of Normandy, including the Bocage country specifically, received considerably less deliberate, systematic defensive preparation in advance of the invasion, reflecting a broader German strategic assumption shared to varying degrees by senior commanders, including Erwin Rommel himself, that the invasion would either be defeated decisively at the beaches themselves, or that any successful landing would need to be countered through a rapid, mobile counterattack rather than a prolonged defensive campaign fought field by field through the interior countryside. What actually happened once the Normandy landings had succeeded and German forces found themselves fighting a prolonged defensive campaign through exactly this bocage terrain was something closer to rapid, effective tactical improvisation by German units on the ground, rather than the execution of some pre-planned, centrally coordinated defensive doctrine specifically designed around hedgerow terrain. German infantry and anti-tank units, and specifically a number of veteran units transferred to the Normandy sector from the brutal attritional fighting on the Eastern Front, brought with them considerable existing tactical experience in exactly the kind of close-quarters, small-unit defensive fighting that the Bocage happened to reward, and adapted this existing tactical knowledge to the specific characteristics of Norman hedgerow country with genuine speed and effectiveness once actual combat revealed the terrain's defensive potential. This distinction matters considerably to how this documentary's central question should actually be understood and answered. The Germans in Normandy did not, in any meaningful sense, outplan the Allies regarding the Bocage before the invasion began. Allied intelligence planning had, if anything, roughly comparable general awareness of the terrain's basic characteristics. What actually happened was that German units, once combat began, proved considerably faster and more effective at tactically exploiting this terrain's inherent defensive potential than American units, whose own doctrine and training had, in the months leading up to the invasion, focused predominantly on the kind of fast, mobile, combined arms warfare that the specific compartmentalized structure of the Bocage simply did not permit, at least not without a specific tactical and technical solution that American forces had not yet developed the moment the fighting actually began.
It's worth pausing here to examine in some detail exactly what kind of warfare American armored and infantry doctrine had actually prepared units to fight, because the specific mismatch between this doctrine and the Bocage's actual tactical demands goes a considerable way toward explaining why the terrain proved so much more effective a defensive obstacle than either side had fully anticipated. American armored doctrine, as it had developed through the interwar period and the early years of American involvement in the war, emphasized speed, mobility, and the coordinated combined arms exploitation of breakthroughs. Tanks operating in close, mutually supporting coordination with infantry, artillery, and air support, designed specifically to identify and rapidly exploit gaps in enemy defensive lines before those defenses could be reconstituted or reinforced. This doctrine, developed with the kind of open, rolling terrain found across much of Western Europe more broadly in mind, assumed a reasonable degree of visibility and maneuverability for both tanks and supporting infantry, conditions the Bocage's compartmentalized hedge-bound field structure directly and fundamentally undermined at almost every turn. Sherman tanks operating within the Bocage found themselves specifically ill-suited to the terrain's actual tactical demands in several distinct, compounding ways. Their relatively high profile made them easier targets for German anti-tank weapons operating at the close ranges the Bocage's small fields typically forced engagements down to.
their limited ability to elevate or depress their main gun sufficiently to engage targets at the extreme close ranges and awkward angles the hedgerow terrain frequently produced left them tactically disadvantaged against German infantry anti-tank teams operating with handheld weapons at very close quarters. And, as already discussed in Act 2, their specific vulnerability while attempting to physically cross the earthen hedgerow banks themselves created a predictable, exploitable moment of maximum vulnerability that German defenders learned to watch for and exploit with considerable tactical discipline. American infantry doctrine, similarly, had generally trained for combat conditions offering somewhat greater visibility and coordination between adjacent units than the Bocage's compartmentalized field structure actually permitted. The doctrine's emphasis on combined arms coordination between infantry and supporting tanks, a genuinely sound and effective tactical principle under most combat conditions American forces would go on to encounter elsewhere in the European campaign, proved considerably harder to execute effectively in terrain where tanks themselves faced such specific, acute vulnerability at every single hedgerow line, and where the dense vegetation itself frequently disrupted the direct visual coordination between infantry and tank crews that effective combined arms tactics generally depended upon.
By late June of 1944, with the Normandy campaign's advance rate slowing to a genuinely alarming crawl and casualty figures mounting steadily across multiple American divisions engaged in the Bocage fighting, considerable pressure built within American command structures, from senior generals down through division and regimental commanders, to identify some kind of practical, deployable solution to the specific tactical problem the hedgerows presented. Several approaches were attempted with varying degrees of success in the weeks immediately following the initial landings. Combat engineers experimented with explosive charges specifically designed to blast openings through the earthen hedgerow banks, allowing tanks to pass through rather than attempting to climb directly over them. This approach worked in a strictly technical sense, but proved genuinely impractical for sustained, rapid tactical use. Each individual hedgerow breach required time to properly place and detonate explosive charges, time during which advancing units remained exposed to German defensive fire, and the specific quantity of explosives required to reliably breach the denser hedgerow banks proved difficult to consistently supply and deploy at the pace the ongoing advance genuinely required. Some units experimented with attaching improvised metal prongs or spikes to the front of tanks, intended to help the vehicle grip and push through the hedgerow bank rather than climbing over it, with mixed and generally inconsistent results depending on the specific density and composition of the particular hedgerow bank being attempted. These early improvised attempts, while not fully successful in their own right, reflected a genuine and increasingly urgent grassroots tactical creativity developing among frontline American units and their supporting engineers, frustrated by the mounting casualties and slow progress, and actively searching through direct trial and error at the unit level for a workable technical solution that formal doctrine and pre-invasion planning had simply failed to anticipate or provide. This is the specific institutional and tactical context this documentary's anchor detail belongs within. Not a solution imposed from above by senior planners working from a map far behind the front lines, but a genuinely bottom-up tactical innovation developed by ordinary soldiers directly grappling with a specific, urgent tactical problem using whatever materials happened to be available to them in the immediate aftermath of the invasion itself. In the final days of June,
in the first days of July 1944, in a specific American unit operating in the Bocage sector, a sergeant named Curtis Culin, serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, is generally credited in the documented record of this specific tactical innovation with developing the practical solution that would go on to be adopted and rapidly deployed across the entire American armored force fighting in Normandy. The specific inspiration for Cullen's design, as documented in multiple contemporary and post-war accounts, came from an unexpected and almost darkly ironic source: steel beach obstacles, originally emplaced by German coastal defense engineers specifically to obstruct Allied landing craft and armored vehicles during the initial invasion, and subsequently captured or recovered by American forces once the beaches themselves had been secured. These German-manufactured steel beams, robust and specifically engineered to withstand considerable mechanical stress, provided exactly the kind of durable raw material needed for the specific mechanical solution Cullen and the soldiers working alongside him had in mind. The device itself, which quickly earned the informal nickname the Rhino among the American troops who began using and manufacturing it, consisted of several sharpened steel prongs, fabricated from these salvaged beach obstacles and welded directly onto the front of a Sherman tank's hull, positioned low to the ground at an angle specifically designed to dig directly into the base of a hedgerow bank as the tank advanced toward it. Rather than attempting to climb over the bank, exposing the tank's vulnerable belly armor in the process, a Rhino-equipped Sherman could drive directly into the base of the hedgerow, with the steel prongs digging into and beneath the compacted earth and root mass, effectively using the tank's own engine power to tear a usable gap directly through the obstacle at ground level, while keeping the tank's own hull level and its main gun properly oriented and ready to engage targets throughout the entire maneuver. The tactical elegance of this solution deserves genuine appreciation because it solved the specific problem identified back in Act 2 with remarkable directness and simplicity. A Rhino-equipped tank no longer needed to expose its belly armor by climbing over a hedgerow bank. It no longer needed to pause its own offensive capability while maneuvering through the obstacle. And, critically, it accomplished all of this using materials, scrap steel, welding equipment, and the practical mechanical ingenuity of ordinary soldiers and unit-level maintenance personnel that were already readily available within the existing supply chain supporting American forces already in Normandy, requiring no complex new manufacturing process or extended supply delay to begin deploying at meaningful scale.
What happened next illustrates with genuine clarity one of the specific institutional strengths of the American command culture this channel has covered in detail elsewhere, in this documentary's earlier examination of George Marshall's Mission Command Doctrine and its role in the broader Normandy campaign. And it's worth drawing that specific connection directly, because the Rhino's rapid adoption represents almost a textbook illustration of exactly the kind of bottom-up tactical innovation that doctrine was specifically designed to encourage and rapidly propagate. Once Cullen's device had demonstrated its practical effectiveness in initial field trials, word of the innovation spread rapidly through American command channels in Normandy, not through some slow, formal process of testing, evaluation, and eventual doctrinal adoption working its way up through multiple layers of headquarters review, but through direct, immediate recognition by observing
officers of the device's obvious practical value, followed by equally rapid, largely decentralized efforts to replicate and deploy the design across as many units as possible in the shortest practical time frame. General Omar Bradley, commanding First Army in the Normandy sector, personally observed a demonstration of the Rhino device within days of its initial development, and recognizing its immediate tactical value, ordered its rapid mass production and distribution across the entire American armored force operating in the Bocage sector. What followed was a genuinely remarkable feat of improvised, decentralized wartime manufacturing. Rather than waiting for the device to be formally manufactured through conventional supply channels back in the United States or Britain, a process that would have introduced weeks or months of delay at a moment when the campaign's momentum was already suffering badly from the ongoing Bocage stalemate, American ordnance units in Normandy itself began mass producing Rhino devices directly from available scrap metal, including, in a detail that later historians and participants themselves have noted with a certain grim satisfaction, a considerable quantity of German steel beach obstacles specifically, repurposing material the German military had originally deployed to obstruct the Allied invasion into the specific tool that would go on to help break the German defensive stalemate in the Bocage that followed that same invasion. Within a remarkably short period, most documented accounts place the timeline at approximately 1 to 2 weeks from Cullen's initial demonstration to widespread operational deployment across multiple American armored divisions. A substantial majority of American Sherman tanks operating in the Normandy Bocage sector had been fitted with some version of the Rhino device, entirely through this decentralized, unit-level production and distribution effort rather than any centrally coordinated formal procurement process. This specific timeline and the specific institutional mechanism that enabled it stands in genuinely stark contrast to the considerably slower, more centralized, and more procedurally constrained equivalent processes that characterized German military innovation and equipment distribution by this specific stage of the war. A contrast this documentary's earlier coverage of American mission command doctrine has already explored in a considerably broader institutional context.
Let's step back now and consider the full arc of this specific tactical episode, because the Bocage fighting's broader legacy extends considerably beyond the specific technical solution the Rhino device eventually provided. The 7 weeks of grinding attritional combat through the Normandy Bocage cost the American Army casualties that, by several documented comparative analyses, ranked among the most costly sustained combat experiences of the entire European campaign, relative to the actual territorial gains achieved during this specific period. This human cost deserves to be stated plainly and without euphemism, because it represents the genuine price paid for the specific gap between pre-war doctrine and planning on one hand, and the actual unanticipated tactical realities of the terrain American forces found themselves fighting through on the other. The Bocage experience also produced genuine, lasting institutional lessons that extended well beyond the specific tactical problem of hedgerow terrain itself, influencing subsequent American military doctrine's approach to terrain analysis and pre-combat tactical preparation in ways that later military historians and doctrine specialists have traced through the post-war development of American combined arms tactical thinking more broadly.
The specific institutional lesson that even extensively planned, thoroughly reconnoitered military operations can encounter tactically decisive terrain factors that pre-combat planning fails to fully anticipate, and that an army's genuine institutional strength lies not merely in avoiding such gaps entirely, but in its demonstrated capacity to rapidly identify and solve them once actual combat reveals their significance, represents a considerably more durable and broadly applicable lesson than the specific technical solution the Rhino device itself provided for this one particular tactical problem. There is a specific irony worth sitting with as this documentary draws toward its close, one that echoes a pattern this channel has traced in other Normandy-related coverage. The specific technical solution that finally broke the Bocage stalemate was fabricated in significant part from steel obstacles the German military had originally manufactured and deployed specifically to obstruct the Allied invasion in the first place. Material intended to stop American tanks from ever reaching the interior of Normandy at all was repurposed within weeks of the invasion's success into the specific tool that helped those same tanks finally break through the terrain-based defensive stalemate that had, for 7 costly weeks, proven considerably more effective at slowing the American advance than the Atlantic Wall's much more elaborate and heavily resourced coastal defenses had ultimately managed to achieve on D-Day itself.
Let's take a step back now and look at the full shape of what this story has actually been about. Because I don't think it's really a story about hedges, or even at its core about one clever piece of scrap metal engineering, as genuinely elegant as Curtis Culin's specific solution to the Bocage problem actually was. I think it's a story about the specific, recurring gap between what a battle plan anticipates on paper and what an actual landscape turns out to demand once real soldiers are moving through it under fire, and about the specific kind of military institution capable of closing that gap quickly once it becomes apparent, rather than remaining bureaucratically or doctrinally paralyzed by a problem that pre-war planning had simply failed to anticipate. Allied planners studied the beaches of Normandy in extraordinary, almost obsessive detail before the invasion. The hedgerows behind those beaches, ordinary and unremarkable as they appeared from the air, received nothing close to that same level of specific tactical attention, and for 7 brutal weeks, that specific gap in pre-war planning cost the American army dearly, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow. What ultimately closed that gap was not a plan handed down from a general's headquarters, working from maps and intelligence reports assembled months before the invasion ever began. It was a sergeant looking at a piece of captured German steel lying on a beach, solving a problem that had been killing his fellow soldiers for weeks, using whatever materials happened to be within reach. And it was an army whose broader institutional culture, the same culture this channel has already examined in considerable detail elsewhere, proved capable of recognizing that sergeant's solution immediately and of getting it into the hands of virtually every tank crew fighting through the Bocage within a matter of days rather than months.
The hedgerows of Normandy very nearly did what the Atlantic Wall itself had failed to do. They very nearly stopped the American advance in France entirely, not through any deliberate German master plan, but simply because they were terrain nobody had fully understood until real soldiers were already dying trying to cross it. And they were finally beaten in the end, not by some overwhelming application of firepower or some brilliant strategic maneuver, but by a single sergeant's welding torch and an army willing to trust that sergeant's idea enough to build it by the thousands within a single week. If you think Curtis Culin and the ordinary soldiers of the Normandy Bocage deserve to be remembered for exactly this kind of practical, front-line ingenuity, take a moment to subscribe. It's genuinely the whole reason this channel exists. And let me know in the comments, had you heard of the rhino hedge cutter before this video, or is this the first time?